Welcome to Deepu Cater Stories. We have all done it. We've all seen a stranger and, in a split second, made a judgment based on their appearance, their clothes, their car, the color of their skin. It's a quiet, ugly part of human nature, but for most of us, those moments pass without consequence. For 1H, I'm a officer named Frank Miller. That single, split-second judgment would prove to be the biggest mistake of his life, because the man he decided to belittle on a quiet Saturday afternoon wasn't just any stranger. He was a man with a secret, a man who was about to take control of the entire city's police force. In the next few minutes, I am going to tell you a powerful story of prejudice, quiet revenge, and the surprising path to redemption. A story that will make you rethink every casual interaction you have. The stillness of an office. The Havenwood Police Department. Outside, the midday sun was bright, casting sharp shadows on the clean pavement. Inside, the light was different, filtered through tinted glass. It was cool, subdued. The air smelled of antiseptic, old paper, and the quiet, heavy weight of authority. Two men stood in the lobby, waiting. Their shoes were polished to a high shine. Their expressions were carefully neutral. The first was Carl Jenkins. His uniform was pressed, the creases sharp enough to cut. His back was straight, a little too straight, as if held up by the rulebook he lived by. The rulebook of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The H. Find. It was his armor, his identity. The second man was Arthur Henderson. He checked his watch for the third time. A man whose time was money, whose concerns were liability, property values, and building bridges with the new city leadership. He was the president of the association, Carl's boss. An officer with a tired face gestured for them to follow. He did not speak. The walk was long. The carpet in the hallway was a deep, municipal blue. It swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Each door they passed seemed identical. Each one closed. Each one hiding its own secrets, its own stories of trouble and consequence. Carl felt a strange pressure building in his chest. A meeting with the new police chief. Arthur had called it a routine courtesy call, a simple meet and greet, but routine did not feel like this. The silence in the hallway was too deep. The officer stopped before a door made of dark, heavy wood. It looked older than the rest of the building, more permanent. A small, polished brass plaque was affixed to it. Chief of Police, David Sterling. The officer knocked once. A quiet, muffled voice answered from within. The door swung open soundlessly, and then they were inside. The office was quiet, a deep, heavy quiet, the kind that settles in rooms of great importance, or great consequence. A large American flag stood in one corner, its colors rich in the dim light. Framed certificates and commendations hung on the wall. They spoke of a long career, of leadership schools, of crisis negotiations, of service, of honor. Behind a large mahogany desk, a man was writing. He did not look up immediately. He finished his sentence with a slow, deliberate movement. He placed the cap back on his pen. A soft click. The sound was unnervingly loud in the stillness of the room. Only then did he raise his head. Arthur Henderson stepped forward, his hand outstretched. A practiced, professional smile already on his face. Chief Sterling, he began, his voice confident. A pleasure to meet you. I'm Arthur Henderson, president of the Willow Creek HOA. And this is our head of community standards, Mr. Carl Jenkins. Arthur's voice trailed off, because Carl Jenkins was no longer beside him. He had stopped, frozen, just inside the doorway, as if he had walked into a wall of ice. The man behind the desk was tall, even sitting down. His uniform was immaculate. The silver badge on his chest caught the light. He carried the air of undisputed authority, but his face belonged to another memory, a much fresher one. The man's eyes were calm, steady. They were not the eyes of a stranger. Carl knew those eyes. He had looked into them before. The realization came not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, cold dread seeping into his bones. Drop by drop. The uniform was wrong. The powerful office was wrong. Those eyes, they belonged to a different man. A man in a simple gray t-shirt, stained with sweat and the dust of a moving day. A man on a quiet suburban street. Just last Saturday, the moving truck parked slightly over the line. The boxes stacked high on the green lawn, the sidewalk, and then the final memory. The one he had tried to forget, an ugly sound on a sunny afternoon, an act of pure contempt spat onto the clean pavement, an insult born from a fleeting sense of power, the power of the HOA, the power of a man in a uniform confronting a man who had none. Carl's breath caught in his throat. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His mind raced, desperately trying to disconnect the two images. The man in the t-shirt and the chief of police, they could not be the same person. It was impossible, but they were. The man behind the desk, David Sterling, the new police chief of Havenwood, his new neighbor. The silence in the room stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Arthur looked back and forth between the unmoving chief and his paralyzed employee, his smile faltering, a deep, profound confusion clouding his features. And then the chief spoke. His voice was even calm, devoid of any discernible emotion, as if he were reading from a report, a file that had long been closed and archived. He did not acknowledge Arthur's outstretched hand. His gaze remained fixed, unwavering, solely on Carl. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, "please, have a seat. I believe we have already met." The chief's eyes held no anger, no hint of triumph, just a simple, chilling statement of fact, a fact that promised a reckoning that had begun on the Saturday before. The Saturday before. The memory began with sunlight. It was 4 days earlier, a Saturday, the kind of warm, late summer day that felt like a gift. In the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates, a large moving truck was parked on the street. Its engine was off. Its back was open, revealing a life packed into cardboard boxes. David Sterling carried a heavy box labeled books. His gray t-shirt was damp with sweat. He moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from building a new home. His wife, Isabella, directed the movers with a graceful authority. She was an architect. She saw spaces not as they were, but as they could be. She saw this new house, this new city, as a blueprint for their future. She caught his eye as he set the box down. She smiled. "You know," she teased, "for a man who commands hundreds of officers, you look very serious about those novels." David wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He laughed, a real laugh. "These are tactical literary deployments. Izzy. Very important." The moment was easy, normal, the simple joy of two people starting a new chapter. The air was filled with the sounds of their new life. Tape being pulled from boxes, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the feeling of possibility, and then another sound entered the picture. A low, electric whine. It grew steadily closer. A white golf cart appeared at the end of the street. It moved without a sound, gliding over the perfect asphalt. A silent judgment. At the wheel was a man in a crisp security uniform. His face was set in a permanent expression of mild disapproval. Carl Jenkins. Isabella saw him first. A small line of concern appeared between her eyebrows. She had seen men like him before. Men who found purpose in small rules. The golf cart pulled up and stopped directly in front of the moving truck. Carl Jenkins did not get out. He sat there for a moment, his hands on the wheel, his eyes scanning the scene. The truck, the boxes on the lawn, the two movers taking a water break. His gaze was that of an inspector finding fault in everything he saw. He finally spoke. His voice was flat, impersonal. "You're going to have to move this vehicle." David walked over. He was polite. "Good afternoon," he said. "We'll be out of here in another hour or so. Just finishing up." Carl pointed a finger at the truck's front wheel. It was resting just barely on the edge of the manicured grass. A violation? Your vehicle is parked on the lawn, he stated. It was not a request. It was an accusation. That's against the HOA bylaws. Section C, paragraph 4. David nodded. He kept his voice even. I understand. We had to give the ramp some clearance on the curb. Like I said, we're almost done. We'll be careful. Carl's tone sharpened. He seemed to enjoy the confrontation, the small stage. You people need to understand, he said, his eyes flicking from David to Isabella and back again. We have standards in this community. We don't just let things slide. The phrase hung in the air. You people. Isabella took a small step closer to her husband. She knew that phrase. They both did. David's posture did not change. His face remained calm, but something shifted in his eyes. A watchfulness. A deep, weary patience. There's no need for that, he said. His voice quiet but firm. We are new residents. We will respect the rules. The truck will be moved shortly. He turned then. A clear signal that the conversation was over. He started to walk back toward the house. It was a dismissal. For Carl Jenkins, it was an insult. His minor authority had been challenged, ignored. As David walked away, Carl muttered something under his breath. A low, ugly word. And then he did something else. He turned his head slightly. He spat. It was not a dramatic act. It was small, vicious. A glob of saliva landed on the clean pavement, just a few feet from where David was standing. It was an exclamation point to his unspoken contempt. David stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood there, his back to the golf cart. He looked down at the ground. Then, slowly, he turned. He looked directly at Carl Jenkins. He said nothing. His silence was louder than any shout. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He raised it. He did not take a picture of the ground. He took a picture of the man, the golf cart, the license number on its side, a photograph, a record, a silent promise of a future conversation. The weight of a badge. The silence in the chief's office was a living thing. It pressed in on them, heavy, suffocating. Carl Jenkins stood frozen, the image from Saturday burning in his mind. David Sterling watched him. His face was a mask of professional calm. But inside, his thoughts were moving with precision. This was not about revenge. Revenge was easy. It was an emotional reflex. This was about something more. He had spent 30 years in law enforcement. He had seen prejudice in all its forms, the loud, hateful shouts, and the quiet, casual dismissals. He had learned that the small insults, the ones that happened on sunny afternoons on quiet streets, were often the most dangerous. They were the symptoms of a deeper sickness, a belief that some people mattered more than others, a sickness he was now hired to cure in Havenwood. Putting Carl Jenkins in a room and shaming him would achieve nothing. It would create a bitter story, a piece of gossip, but setting a new standard that required something else. It required turning a personal insult into an impersonal principle, a lesson. Arthur Henderson finally found his voice. It was the voice of damage control, smooth, apologetic. Chief Sterling, he said, stepping between them as if to block a physical blow. Clearly there has been a terrible misunderstanding. I am certain Mr. Jenkins had no idea. I didn't know. Carl stammered, the words finally breaking free. His voice was thin, barely a whisper. I swear. I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job, enforcing the rules. David's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He leaned forward in his chair. The movement was small, but it commanded the entire room. That is the entire problem. Mr. Jenkins, he said, his voice low and cutting. The problem is not that you did not know who I was. The problem is that you did not care who that man in the t-shirt was. A person, a new neighbor, a father. Your respect, it seems, is conditional. It comes with a uniform, with a title, and let me be very clear, that is a worthless kind of respect. He turned his gaze to Arthur Henderson. who flinched as if struck. This meeting isn't about a truck parked on the grass, Mr. Henderson. It's about a culture where a man with a small amount of authority feels entitled to treat another human being with contempt. That culture, whether it's in a homeowners association or a police department, is a poison. It erodes trust. It creates division. And it is the opposite of everything my department will stand for. He stood up. The movement was fluid, decisive. He was no longer just a man behind a desk. He was the embodiment of the authority they had disrespected. David's words echoed beyond the walls of that office. They touched upon a core question. Does the respect we give to others depend on their status, or is it a fundamental human right? He walked to the door, opening it, a clear signal. The meeting was over. Your internal HOA matters are your own business, he said, his voice returning to a cool, professional tone. You will handle them as you see fit. But the standard for this city and for this police department will be different. It will be absolute. He looked at Carl one last time, not with anger, but with a profound, weary disappointment. Now, if you will, excuse me, he said, turning his back on them. I have a police department to run. David Sterling has drawn a clear line in the sand. But what was truly in Carl Jenkins's heart at that moment, if you believe Carl made a simple, terrible mistake, comment the number 1 below. If you believe his action came from a place of true prejudice, comment the number 2. The consequences of this meeting are just beginning for both men. Stay with me to discover what happens when Carl must face his wife, and David must face his new police force. The first briefing. The door to the chief's office closed with a solid, final click. David Sterling did not pause. He did not look back. He walked down the quiet hallway to another room, the briefing room. Inside, about 20 people were waiting. They were the command staff of the Havenwood Police Department. Captains, lieutenant, sergeants. The gears that made the machine run, they sat around a long, polished table, their conversation stopping the moment he entered. An expectant silence fell over the room. David walked to the head of the table. He surveyed their faces. Some were curious. Some were wary. Some were openly skeptical. They were sizing him up. He knew the whispers. The new chief from the big city, an outsider, come to tell them how to do their job. He saw one face in particular, Captain Eva Rostova. She sat near the front, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She was a veteran of the department, respected, pragmatic. She had seen chiefs come and go. Her eyes were not hostile. They were simply waiting for proof. David did not sit down. He stood, his hands resting lightly on the back of the chair. Good morning, he began. His voice filled the room, calm and steady. My name is David Sterling. As of today, I have the privilege of serving as your chief of police. He let the words settle. I'm not going to stand here and talk about statistics or budget proposals. We will have plenty of time for that. Today, I want to talk about one thing, the foundation, the principle upon which everything else we do must be built. He paused, looking from face to face, making eye contact with as many as he could. That principle is respect. Not the respect you show me because of this badge. Not the respect you show the mayor because of his office. I'm talking about the respect we are sworn to give every single person in this city, without condition. He saw a few officers shift in their seats. This was not the speech they were expecting. The true measure of a police officer, he continued, his voice gaining intensity, is not how they treat a judge or a city councilman. The true measure is in how they speak to a scared teenager during a traffic stop, how they listen to a homeless person reporting a stolen blanket, how they treat a father moving his family into a new home on a Saturday. He saw a flicker of recognition in Eva Rostova's eyes. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew his words were coming from a real place. Our integrity is tested in the small moment, the moments when no one is recording, when there are no medals to be won. Those moments define us. They define this department, and they determine whether the people of Havenwood see us as their protectors or as just another group of people with power. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the older, more skeptical faces. Starting next month, every sworn officer in this department, including myself, will begin a mandatory new training program focused on de-escalation, communication, and implicit bias. There will be no exceptions. A low murmur went through the room. This is not a punishment, he said firmly. It is a resetting of our standard. The standard is this: we will treat every person with the dignity they are owed as a human being. If that is a standard you are unwilling to meet, this is no longer the right place for you. He finished. The room was silent. He had not told his story. He had not needed to. He had transformed his personal experience into a professional mandate. A new law for the tribe. As the officers began to file out of the room, their usual loud chatter replaced by quiet, thoughtful conversations, David walked to the large window. He looked out over the city. His city now. His gaze drifted in the direction of Willow Creek Estates. He knew the real test was not in this briefing room. It was on the streets outside, and in the mind of a man who had just lost everything over a small, thoughtless act of contempt. A kingdom of one. The drive home was a blur of perfect green lawns and identical, silent houses. Carl Jenkins did not truly see them. He did not see the familiar, orderly kingdom he had spent years protecting. He saw only the calm, unreadable face of David Sterling, the chief of police, his new neighbor. His mind was a chaotic storm, a tempest of anger, humiliation, and a desperate search for justification. He replayed the scene in the office over and over again, editing it with each repetition. In his version, he was not the one at fault. He was the victim. He was a man just doing his job, a good man, a hard-working man, punished for upholding the sacred rules of the community. The rules, they were all he had ever had. They were the walls of his kingdom. It was a setup, he told himself, the thought latching on like a lifeline. That man, that Chief Sterling, he must have known who Carl was from the very beginning. He must have planned the entire thing, provoked him with that casual dismissal, waited for him to make one small mistake. It was a trap. The world was full of traps now for men like him. Men who believed in order, in standards, men who were being pushed aside. He parked his car in the driveway of his own modest house. It was a neat house, smaller than the others, but immaculate. The lawn was always cut to the perfect height. The hedges were trimmed into flawless rectangles. He was a good neighbor. He followed every rule. He enforced them. How could this be happening to him? He walked inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. His wife, Linda, was in the kitchen, sitting at the small wooden table, a half-read book open in front of her. She looked up when he came in, her glasses perched on her nose. She did not smile. Her eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him for 35 years, were full of a quiet, waiting sadness. She knew the storm clouds that gathered behind his eyes before he ever spoke a single word. "Well?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, but it held the weight of a question she was afraid to have answered. Carl threw his keys onto the counter. The metallic clatter was a harsh, angry sound in the quiet room. "I lost my job, Linda," he said. His voice was thick with a strange, bitter mix of rage and despair. "Henderson fired me, right there in the parking lot of the police station. Said I was a liability. A liability. After 15 years. He waited for her sympathy, for her outrage on his behalf. He expected her to rush over, to hold his hand, to rail against the injustice of it all, to confirm his version of the story, but Linda did not move. She simply closed her book, marking her page with a careful, deliberate finger. "Why, Carl?" she asked again, her voice still soft. What happened in that meeting? So Carl launched into his story. The story he had been building in his head on the drive home. It was a tale of a misunderstanding, of political correctness gone mad. He spoke of the moving truck, a clear violation. He spoke of his simple, professional request. He painted himself as the guardian of the community, a lone soldier of order, unfairly brought down by a powerful man with a personal grudge. He ended his speech with a flourish of righteous indignation. "I lost my job," he repeated, his voice rising, cracking at the edges. All because I was doing my duty. Linda listened. She did not interrupt. Her gaze never left his face, tracking the storm of emotions passing over it. When he was finally finished, breathless and red-faced, she remained silent for a long moment. The only sound in the kitchen was the low, a steady hum of the refrigerator. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he saw not just sadness in her eyes, but a deep, profound exhaustion, as if she had been waiting for this moment, this conversation, for a very, very long time. She did not comfort him. She did not argue with his version of events. She simply asked the one question he had been so desperately avoiding in his own mind, the one question that cut through all his carefully constructed excuses, all his angry justifications. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her closed book. Her voice was not accusatory. It was just tired. So incredibly, deeply tired. Carl, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me the truth. What exactly did you say to that man? Ripples and resistance. Change does not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like the tide, a slow, persistent creep that rearranges the landscape, grain of sand by grain of sand. And in Havenwood, the tide had begun to turn. In the weeks that followed the meeting, the story of Carl Jenkins and the new police chief began to circulate. It became a piece of local folklore, twisting and changing with each telling. In the Willow Creek Estates coffee shop, where the conversations were as manicured as the lawns, the story was that Carl, a dedicated community servant, had been unfairly dismissed for simply doing his job. He had stood up to an arrogant newcomer who thought he was above the rules. The HOA became a symbol of local control under siege. At the city council meetings and in the corridors of power, the whisper was different. It was that the new police chief, David Sterling, had a personal vendetta, that he was thin-skinned, that he had used the full weight of his new office to crush a minor disagreement. The truth, as it often does, got lost somewhere in the middle of these opposing currents. Inside the Havenwood Police Department, the ripples were more immediate, more tangible. Chief Sterling's first briefing had sent a clear, unambiguous message. The standard had changed. For some, it was a welcome relief. Younger officers, who had grown tired of the old guard cynicism, quietly embraced the new training initiatives. They saw a path to better community relations, a way to de-escalate the tensions that seemed to be rising everywhere. They saw a chance to do a job they could be proud of in a different, more thoughtful way. But for others, the new standard was an attack, a threat. In the precinct break room, where the coffee was perpetually burnt and the complaints were always fresh, the resistance had a voice. It belonged to a veteran patrol sergeant named Miller, a man with 20 years on the force, a man who believed he had seen it all and that nothing ever really changed. Implicit bias training. He scoffed one morning, pouring creamer into a stained mug. That's just a fancy new way of calling us all racists. Pretty soon we'll have to ask for written permission before we chase a suspect down an alley. A few of the older officers chuckled in agreement. They saw the new rules not as a step forward, but as a set of handcuffs designed by an academic who didn't understand their world. This new chief, this outsider, he was trying to fix something that, in their minds, wasn't broken. David Sterling was not deaf to the whispers. He was not blind to the skeptical glances in the hallway. He knew that changing a culture was like turning a large, heavy ship. It required constant pressure on the rudder and a deep well of patience. He spent his days in meetings, reviewing decades-old policies, analyzing citizen complaint data, but he also walked the halls. He made it a point to learn names, to ask about families, to listen to stories from the street. He made his presence felt, not as a warden watching over his prisoners, but as a constant, steady reminder of the new direction. His strongest, if sometimes keenest, ally was Captain Eva Rostova. She had been skeptical at first, but she was a pragmatist. She saw the rising tide of citizen complaints in the city's official records. She saw the erosion of public trust with her own eyes. She recognized the undeniable truth in the chief's words. One afternoon, they sat in his office. A thick file of old, ugly incident reports on the desk between them. "This isn't about a few bad apples, Eva," David said, tapping the thickest file with his finger. "Look at the pattern here. The language used in the reports. The dismissive tone, the immediate escalation. This is a symptom of a culture that has been allowed to fester for a long time. This is where we have to start." Eva nodded slowly, her eyes on the damning words in black and white. She had defended some of these men in the past, had stood by them, but she couldn't deny the ink on the pages. She found herself caught between her loyalty to the officers she had worked with for decades and her growing, undeniable belief in the chief's vision. That evening, David sat in his own living room. All the boxes were finally unpacked. The art was on the walls. The house was starting to feel like a home. Isabella sat across from him. Reading a novel, she watched him over the top of her book as he stared out the window into the gathering dusk. Lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. David turned to her. A faint, weary smile touched his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "that planting a new tree in an old, dense forest is never an easy job." The confession of a father. For 3 weeks, Carl Jenkins existed in a fog of suffocating silence and a shame that felt like a physical weight. He spent his days in the garage, tinkering with a lawnmower that was not broken, tightening bolts that were already tight. He avoided his neighbors, crossing the street if he saw one of them walking their dog. He stopped watching the news. Most of all, he avoided the question his wife had asked him, the question that echoed in the quiet, empty moments of the day. "What exactly did you say to that man?" He had no answer for her, because answering it meant finally admitting the unvarnished truth to himself. The initial storm of anger had faded, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. He had lost more than a job. He had lost his identity, his purpose. He was no longer Carl Jenkins, guardian of the community rules. He was just Carl, a man in his late 50s with too much time on his hands and a knot of regret in his stomach. One morning, he woke up before the sun and knew he could not continue living inside the silence. It was too loud. He got dressed, putting on a clean collared shirt. He got in his car. He did not tell Linda where he was going. He drove not to the manicured, familiar streets of Willow Creek, but to the imposing brick and concrete of the Havenwood Police Department. He sat in his car in the visitors' parking lot for a full 20 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every instinct told him to turn back. He was terrified. But the memory of his wife's tired, disappointed eyes was, somehow, even more terrifying. He finally got out of the car. He asked the officer at the front desk, his voice barely a croak, if it was possible to see the chief of police. He had no appointment. He fully expected to be turned away, to be told the chief was busy. But a few minutes later, the officer returned and, with a look of mild surprise, led him down the same long, quiet hallway he had walked down in another lifetime. David Sterling was surprised to see him, but his face showed none of it. He stood up from his desk as Carl was shown in. "Mr. Jenkins," he said. His voice was neutral, holding no warmth, but also no malice. This time, David did not gesture to the imposing chairs in front of his desk. Instead, he walked to a small seating area in the corner of the office. 2 simple but comfortable armchairs and a small table between them. He sat in one and indicated for Carl to take the other. It was a gesture of disarming equality, stripping the room of its inherent power imbalance. Carl sat down heavily. His hands were trembling, so he clasped them together in his lap. I'm not here to ask for my job back," Carl began, his voice rough with disuse. "I know that's gone. I had to," he trailed off, struggling to find the words he hadn't even known he was looking for. David waited. He did not rush him. He did not fill the silence. He simply listened, giving the man space to find his truth. Finally, Carl looked up. His eyes, for the first time, were not filled with anger or self-pity. They were filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "I wanted to tell you why," he said, not as an excuse. "I don't have one. Just to explain." He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then he began to speak, not about the rules of the HOA. I was body and fine back, or the bylaws, but about his father. His father had been a factory worker, a man who had done the same job on the same assembly line for 40 years, a man who believed in hard work, loyalty, and the simple promise that if you did your part, you would be taken care of. And he was a man who had been laid off at the age of 58, replaced by a machine that could do his job faster and cheaper. His father had spent the last 10 years of his life bitter and afraid of a changing world he no longer understood, afraid of the people who were, in his confused and angry mind, taking his place. He used to talk about it all the time at the dinner table, Carl said, his voice cracking, breaking on the memory. He'd see a new family move into the neighborhood, a family that didn't look like us, and he'd get this look in his eye. He'd say, "There they go. Carl, taking over, changing everything." I grew up breathing that fear. It got inside me without me even knowing. He looked directly at David, his gaze unflinching now, filled with a raw, painful honesty. "When I saw you that day, moving into that big, beautiful house, looking so successful, so confident, I didn't see a new neighbor. I saw the change my father always warned me about, the world he was so scared of, and I acted like a fool. A scared, bitter fool," he finished. The confession hung in the quiet air between them. A lifetime of inherited fear laid bare. David was silent for a long time. He looked at the man in front of him. He no longer saw just the arrogant "Oh, thank you for watching. Officer." He saw the son of a scared factory worker. He saw the product of a fear passed down from one generation to the next like a tarnished heirloom. In that room, there was no longer a police chief and a civilian who had wronged him. There were just two men, two fathers, facing the heavy, complicated legacy of the past. The confession of Carl Jenkins was a small step, but in the quiet stillness of that office, it felt like a brave one. In that room, there was no longer a police chief and a violator, just two men, two fathers, facing the legacy of the past. The confession of Carl Jenkins was a small step, but it was a brave one. If you are still listening to this point, please comment with the number 1 below, just to let me know that you're still on this journey with me. Your presence here is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part of this story, where we will find out if a single moment of truth can heal wounds that run so deep. An unlikely alliance. Several months passed. Autumn gave way to a cold, crisp winter, and winter slowly began to thaw into the hesitant green of a Havenwood spring. In the city, the changes were subtle, but they were there, like the slow shifting of a deep current beneath a calm surface. The new training programs at the police department were underway. The grumbling in the precinct break room hadn't vanished entirely, but it was quieter now, replaced by a grudging acceptance and, in some corners, a genuine, if reluctant, effort. Chief Sterling's presence was no longer a novelty. It was the new foundation, solid and unmoving. He knew, however, that training and policies were not enough. Trust was not built in a classroom full of officers. It had to be built in the open, face to face with the community it was meant to serve. And so, he launched a new, and to some, a radical initiative. He called it the Havenwood Community Dialogue. It was a simple idea on the surface, a monthly town hall meeting, held not at the police station, but in a neutral, welcoming space like the public library. There would be no agenda, no scripts or pre-approved questions, just an open floor for an open conversation. For the first meeting, the library's community room was filled with a nervous, electric energy. Police officers, at the chief's request, lined one wall, their arms crossed, looking deeply uncomfortable out of their uniforms and on unfamiliar ground. The chairs were filled with citizens, a mix of curious supporters, longtime critics of the department, and people who had simply never been in the same room with a police officer without seeing flashing lights. David Sterling stood at a simple podium at the front of the room. He welcomed everyone, his voice calm and steady, a reassuring anchor in the tense atmosphere. He spoke briefly about his vision for a department built on partnership, not power. Then, he said something that sent a palpable wave of surprise through the room. "Tonight," he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him, "we're not going to start by talking about policing tactics or crime statistics. We're going to start by talking about something more fundamental. We're going to talk about prejudice, about how easy it is for any of us to see a stranger and make a snap judgment, an assumption based on nothing but our own fears. And to kick off that very human conversation, I've invited a fellow citizen to share his personal story with us, a resident of Willow Creek Estates." In the back of the room, Captain Eva Rostova watched, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She had no idea who this guest speaker could be. The chief had kept this part of the plan entirely to himself, a move that was both intriguing and slightly unnerving. David continued, "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Carl Jenkins." A collective gasp, sharp and audible, went through the officer's side of the room. Eva Rostova's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. Carl Jenkins, the H. What about stance? A guy, the man whose story had become a whispered, cautionary tale in the department. It made no sense. It was a huge, unpredictable risk. Carl emerged from a side door, looking small and out of place under the bright library lights. He looked thinner than he had months ago. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and slack, not a uniform. He walked to the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a single, folded sheet of paper on it. He looked out at the sea of faces, the skeptical officers, his curious former neighbors, the strangers. He carefully avoided looking at David. The story of the invitation had been a quiet one. A single phone call a week earlier, David had called Carl at home. He had explained the idea for the community dialogue, the need for honesty, for vulnerability, and then he had asked, "I can't," Carl had said immediately, his voice tight with a deep, lingering shame. "What would I even say? They'll all hate me." David's voice on the other end of the line had been patient, without a hint of pressure. "You wouldn't be speaking to them, Carl. You would be speaking for them. For every person who has ever made a mistake based on fear, your story, it has more power to teach my officers and this community than any lecture I could ever give." And so, here he was, standing in the quiet terror of the spotlight. He cleared his throat. The room was utterly, completely silent. "My name is Carl Jenkins," he began, his voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "For 15 years, I worked for the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I was proud of my job. I believed I was protecting our community, protecting our standards, our property values." He paused, taking a slow, calming breath. "But I was also living in a prison I didn't even know I was in. It was a prison built of fear, a fear I inherited from my father, like an old piece of furniture, a fear of change, a fear of people who were different from me." He told his story. He didn't spare himself a single detail. He told them about the moving truck, about his arrogance, his need to feel important. He told them about seeing David Sterling not as a new neighbor, but as a symbol of a world that was leaving him behind. And then, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, he told them about the ugly, thoughtless act of spitting on the pavement. He owned his mistake completely, its shame washing over him even now. "I lost my job that week," he said, finally looking up from his paper, his eyes scanning the crowd, no longer avoiding their gaze. "And I deserved to, but in losing that job, I started to find something else, something I had lost a long time ago, the truth about myself. Prejudice, it is a kind of prison. And for my whole life, I had been locking myself inside it without even realizing I was holding the key." He finished. A profound, unbroken silence held the room. No one moved, no one coughed, no one whispered. Then, David Sterling walked from the side of the room to the podium. He did not say a word. He simply placed a firm, reassuring hand on Carl's shoulder for a moment. Then, he reached out and shook Carl's hand in front of everyone. The handshake was a powerful, silent message that everyone in the room understood. It was a message of forgiveness, of redemption, of the radical possibility of a second chance. Later that evening, as people were slowly filing out, their quiet conversations filled with a new, more thoughtful tone, Eva Rostova approached the chief. She looked from the departing figure of Carl Jenkins, who was speaking quietly with one of his former neighbors, back to David. She shook her head, a slow smile of genuine, hard-won admiration spreading across her face. "Chief," she said, her voice filled with a newfound respect that went beyond rank. "Tonight, I learned something about policing that they never, ever teach you at the academy." A quiet evening on Willow Creek. A year passed. The seasons in Havenwood turned with their slow, reliable grace, each one leaving its distinct mark on the town. The sharp, clean bite of winter melted into the soft, hopeful green of spring. Summer arrived with its long, warm evenings, the air filled with the scent of cut grass and the sound of children playing late into the twilight. And now, autumn had returned, painting the leaves of the old oak trees along Willow Creek Drive in brilliant shades of gold, amber, and deep, resonant red. The changes in the city were like the changing of the seasons, gradual, almost imperceptible if you looked day to day, but undeniable when you stood back and took a longer view. The Havenwood community dialogues had become a monthly fixture, the initial tension of the first meeting replaced by a familiar, sometimes difficult, but always respectful exchange of ideas. For the first time in 5 years, the number of official citizen complaints filed against the police department had dropped, a small but significant crack in a long-standing wall of mistrust. The whispers in the precinct break room still existed. They always would, but they were now just whispers. No longer the dominant, cynical voice of the room. A new culture, fragile but persistent, was slowly, quietly taking root. One cool evening in late October, just as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple, David Sterling was out for a walk. It was a habit he had developed over the past year, a simple ritual to decompress, to leave the immense weight of the chief's office behind and just be a resident of the city he served. He walked the familiar, peaceful streets of his neighborhood, the air crisp and clean, the scent of wood smoke hanging faintly in the air. As he rounded a corner onto a street lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, he saw a familiar figure in a nearby yard. It was Carl Jenkins. He was in his front yard, no longer in the rigid HOA uniform, but in a comfortable old sweatshirt and jeans. He was with a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his grandson, who was visiting for the weekend. Carl was patiently showing the boy how to grip a baseball, how to shift his weight, how to follow through with his throw. His movements were slow and deliberate. There was a lightness to him now, a quiet, easy gentleness that David had never seen in him before. The heavy armor of rules and resentment he had worn for so long seemed to have finally been taken off. Carl looked up from instructing his grandson and saw David walking towards them. For a fleeting second, a shadow of the old awkwardness, a memory of their past, passed between them, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He smiled, a small, but completely genuine smile. He raised a hand in a simple, neighborly wave. David smiled back and waved, walking over to the edge of the perfectly manicured lawn. "Evening, Carl," David said, his voice easy. "Evening, Chief," Carl replied, a comfortably Abbott. He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "This is Noah. Noah, this is our neighbor, Mr. Sterling. He's a very important man in our town." The boy looked up at David with wide, curious eyes, a baseball clutched in his small hand. "Are you really the police chief?" he asked, his voice full of awe. David smiled down at him. "I am, but tonight, I'm just out for a walk." They did not speak of the past. They did not need to. It was a closed, settled chapter in both their lives. Instead, they talked about the things neighbors talk about on a pleasant autumn evening: the weather, and how it was turning colder. The chances of the local high school football team making it to the state finals this year. It was a normal, wonderfully unremarkable conversation. The kind of conversation that happens 1,000 times a day on quiet suburban streets all across the country, and in its very normality. It was extraordinary. After a few minutes, David nodded. "Well, I'll let you two get back to your practice," he said. "The major leagues are waiting. Good to see you. Carl, you too. Noah." He continued on his walk down the street, the gentle sound of the baseball thumping into a small leather glove fading behind him. He had almost reached the end of the block when he heard a voice call out, friendly and clear, "Hey." Chief David turned. Carl was standing there in his yard, the baseball held loosely in his hand. His grandson was watching them both. "Just call me Carl," he said. There was no formality in his voice, no deference, just a simple, open, neighborly invitation. David Sterling nodded, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face, reaching his eyes. "Okay, Carl," he called back, his own voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "And you can call me David." He turned and continued his walk home, the soft light of the street lamps beginning to glow around him. He knew the long, slow fight against fear and prejudice was never truly over. It was a battle fought every single day, in big city policies and in the quiet, hidden chambers of the human heart. But tonight, walking down this peaceful street, a new and profound sense of hope settled over him. Change, he thought to himself, wasn't always a storm that tore down the old forest. Sometimes, it was just two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a deep divide, finally learning to call each other by name. In the end, this wasn't a story about revenge, but about the quiet, difficult work of understanding. It teaches us that our truest character is revealed not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we treat those we believe have no power at all. It's a reminder that beneath any uniform or title, we are all just neighbors. What lesson did you take away from Carl and David's story? I would be truly honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. If stories like this resonate with you, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to Deepu Cater Stories and joining our community. Thank you for walking this path with me today.